Welcome to the worship service of Grace United Church in Wellsville, New York. We're so glad that you're taking some time to worship with us today, and we hope that you find this service meaningful. I have a question for you. What comes to mind when you think about the word wisdom? Perhaps you imagine an older person on a mountaintop like a guru, or a very wise person speaking to a group of people who are hanging out on their every single word. Maybe you think of a teacher that you've had, or an inspiring historical figure that maybe you read about, or perhaps it's your old high school coach. Older and wiser are often words that are used together to describe the idea that real wisdom comes with age and with life experience. Well, that may be true, of course, but the hard truth is that real wisdom isn't so much about the quantity of life experience as it is about the quality of it and what one has learned by their life experiences. I remember discovering this difference when I was in seminary. You see, I volunteered at a nursing home as a chaplain in Louisville, Kentucky, and weekly I would go there and I'd lead a worship service, and then afterward I would visit from room to room and talk with the different residents there. I would listen to story after story after story. And as I listened to these stories, I began to wonder about people's lives and some of their life choices. Now, I had been raised to respect my elders. I remember hearing words like Proverbs 16, "Gray hair is a crown of glory. It's gained in a righteous life." I believe that if people lived to old age, they certainly were worthy recipients of their advanced age. I assumed that they were wise. After all, they must have lived a righteous life. But sometimes I wondered. I remember talking with one of my professors about some of the unusual choices that some of these people had made. I was a bit unsettled, kind of wondering just how wise they were. He asked me, "Do you think that all older people are wise?" Then he quoted H.L. Mencken, who said, "The older I grow, the more I distrust the familiar doctrine that age brings wisdom." Age doesn't always bring wisdom, does it? Qualifying for an AARP card or having gray hair doesn't necessarily make us wise, does it? Especially if we fail to take the lessons that have come our way and change as a result of them. Unfortunately, too often those lessons come as a result of hard times. Researchers suggest that there are three kinds of wisdom. General wisdom is understanding the fundamental pragmatics of life and of the human condition. Basically, how to survive and thrive in the world. Words of wisdom that help you survive, like, "A stitch in time saves 9. Oh, the tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Slow and steady wins the race." This kind of wisdom guides our everyday practices. Then there's personal wisdom. Personal wisdom is where a person gains a deeper perspective on themselves and their place in the world. They've reflected and they've developed strategies for dealing with the problems of life. Now, this kind of wisdom came to horror novelist Stephen King alongside a highway in rural Maine at one point. He was out walking, and one day, when he was walking on the shoulder of the road, he was hit by a truck who had a distracted driver, and Stephen King nearly died. After a long process of recuperation, he was invited to give a commencement address at Vassar College. This is what he said. "What will you do?" he asked all these graduates. "Well, I'll tell you one thing you're not going to do, and that's take it with you. I'm worth, well, I don't exactly know how many millions of dollars. I'm still basically in the third world compared to Bill Gates, but on the whole, I'm doing okay. And a couple years ago, I found out that you can't take it with you, and I understood what that means. I found out while I was lying in the ditch on the side of a country road, covered with mud and blood, with the tibia of my right leg poking out the side of my jeans like the branch of a tree taken down in a thunderstorm. Well, it was when I was there, I recognized I had a MasterCard in my wallet, but when you're lying in a ditch with broken glass in your hair, no one really accepts your MasterCard. If you find yourself in the ER with a serious infarct, or your doctor tells you, yeah, that lump that you felt in your breast, yeah, it's a tumor. Well, you can't wave your Diners Club at it and make it go away. We all know that life is ephemeral. But on that particular day, and in the months that followed, I got a painful but extremely valuable look at life's simple backstage truths. We come in naked and broke. We might be dressed when we go out, but we're just as broke. Warren Buffett, going out broke. Bill Gates, going out broke. Tom Hanks, going out broke. Stephen King, broke. You guys, broke. Not a crying dime. And how long in between? How long have you got to be in the chips? I'm aware of the time passing by, and they say in the end, it's the blink of an eye. That's how long. Just the blink of an eye. Though even at that point in his life, Stephen King was a very popular and successful author. His perspectives had been altered by this terrible accident, and he learned to number his days and make the most of them. That is personal wisdom. Then there's a third kind of wisdom. It's when we develop a type of wisdom that brings self-transcendence. Self-transcendence develops in people who are deeply spiritual and have a deep wisdom, a kind of knowing that comes from a deep awareness. It's a more meaningful or an intimate kind of wisdom, an understanding of the heart. For example, think about the relationship of a married couple, particularly of an older married couple. They may have general wisdom on how to have a successful relationship, and they may have developed personal wisdom, and they're aware of how their spouse may respond in various situations, and what actions that they can do that might displease them or might make the other person's day. But then, especially if they've been married for some time, they understand one another's heart. This is the kind of wisdom or knowledge that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 7, verse 22. There he explains how many will say, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out devils in your name, done great and mighty things in your name? And he will say, depart from me, I never knew you. You see, knowing God is not just an acknowledgement of the mind, of saying the right words. It's really knowing God's heart. It's having the wisdom of God that comes from a meaningful relationship. This kind of deep knowing or wisdom is much more difficult to cultivate. Self-transcendent wisdom requires a process of learning, of practice, and of a deepening awareness of oneself and of God. It really requires quite a bit of work. Today we'll consider how our lives can be shaped by the wisdom of God. We'll consider how one man, Solomon, though he was given much wisdom, flourished, and yet he still made some significant mistakes that led him in a different direction. Now, often in our lives, learning comes through the experiences of hardship. These shape our thinking and our understandings. Now, though we don't usually intentionally seek out challenges or problems in our lives, when we do face them, they can be turning points in our lives. When Solomon was very young, he faced a very interesting turning point. Solomon was the second son of Bathsheba and David, and he was the one that was appointed to sit on the throne of David. The scriptures say that his rule was firmly established. He showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given to him by his father David, except for that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places, as well as in the temple. At Gibeon, which is a Canaanite city where he had been offering sacrifices, He had a dream where God came to him and asked him, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Now imagine God coming to you in a dream when you're in your late teens or 20s and offering you anything that you might ask. Chances are that wisdom might not be on the top of the list. But Solomon recognizes that he is young, only a little child, he says. "I do not know how to go out or how to come in." And of course, he doesn't have the experiences of his father, David, who was this great ruler. He ruled so many people that they couldn't be numbered or counted. So Solomon asked God to give him an understanding mind to govern your people, he said, to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this great people? He asked. Solomon asked God for the wisdom of God. Now, even before this event, he loved the Lord and he walked in the statutes of his father David. We could call that general wisdom. Solomon followed the example of his father, even before he had this amazing encounter with God. This reflects the truth of Proverbs chapter 1. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge or wisdom. But what he lacked really was experience. For example, his marriage to an Egyptian wife would later prove problematic. And also, sacrificing at the high places, which really echoes the Canaanite religious practices. This was not pleasing to God. The writer of 1 Kings seems to hint that these are not wise choices in terms of God's version of wisdom, though actually they were perfectly acceptable given the conventional wisdom of the time. Yet Solomon's love for God was the foundation of the early part of his rule. It enabled him to be the one to build God's temple. I imagine God granting him a kind of infusion of wisdom that was designed to fill in the gaps of Solomon's lack of experience. But here's an interesting subpoint. God's offer to wisdom and a long life is really contingent upon Solomon actually learning and applying this wisdom that he's received. Solomon didn't ask for riches or for a long life or for his enemies to die off. Now, these are things that we might expect from someone young, his age, who suddenly becomes a king. Yet, God will grant him those things conditionally. God says, "If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life." So, in order for his reign to be long and effective, Solomon would need to continue to follow God, to maintain a particular way of life that demonstrated godly wisdom. The wisdom God gave him would need to be lived out in his experience, day after day after day. This is the same story that began in the first pages of the Bible and continues in our lives today. We always have a choice whether or not to follow God's wisdom, whether or not to seek God as we walk the path of our own lives and as we encounter its many challenges. The story of choice is a story that we see repeated in the Bible. God created Adam and Eve to rule and to care for the world in intimacy and love with one another and with God. You might imagine, to successfully rule and care for the world, it takes wisdom. The humans were given a choice in how to gain this wisdom. They could rule by God's wisdom, which would lead to life, or they could be wise in their own eyes. And that's what they chose. Immediately, there was a division between them and between God. You see, there are no shortcuts to God's wisdom. Eating the fruit of knowledge of good and evil took them down a different path that led to estrangement from one another and estrangement from God. And we still, even to this day, we have trouble ruling and caring for the world with love, relying on God's wisdom. But the creation story holds out hope for a future human that will make the right choice and rely on God's wisdom. Someone like Solomon, perhaps. In fact, when you think about Solomon's rule, in some ways, he reversed the failure of Adam and Eve. He had an abundance of food and provision. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore, the Bible says. They were very contented, with plenty to eat and to drink. But Solomon fails. Why? Because he marries hundreds of women from other nations, and he's deceived to follow their gods. Now, we're all susceptible to turning away from God's wisdom. All of us face choices. And it's especially during those difficult times that we have the opportunity to turn toward or to turn away from God's wisdom. If true wisdom is gained by experience, and particularly by experience with hardship, it's also the product of recognizing that the experience of walking in God's ways is difficult, especially in compared to the ways of the world. Now, all of us would love for God to impart all the wisdom that we need just in one moment, like what happened in Solomon's dream. But as we'll see with Solomon's own life, having wisdom is a use it or lose it proposition. In this week's alternative reading from Proverbs, we hear the call to lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the way of insight. Following in God's ways often requires saying a painful no to the ways of the world that are attractive and easy and well-trodden by most people. Solomon's God-given wisdom was on display in his judgment, such as his mediation of the conflict between two mothers in 1 Kings chapter 3. It was also evident in his administrative skill in managing Judah and Israel toward prosperity, and of course in building the temple. He showcased that wisdom in the writings in Proverbs and in other wisdom literature. His wisdom was widely known in the Mediterranean world, to the point that people came from all the nations around to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And yet, by 1 Kings 11, things begin to go tragically wrong with Solomon. The wisdom that God had put into his mind failed to translate into action, and so Solomon instead lived out the conventional wisdom of the kings of the ancient Near Eastern world. He gathered up more riches and chariots and wives in an attempt to solidify his reign. Did you know that it took 7 years to build the temple? And guess how long it took to build Solomon's palace? 13. That must have been some palace. Why do you think that it took 6 years longer to build his palace? One guy I read about, he quipped that Solomon had 700 wives. He said, it's hard enough with just one wife. I'm surprised it didn't take 13 years just to decide on the front door, never mind the whole palace. I suspect that it took him 6 years longer, not because of his wife's input, but rather because he had turned away from God and he had acquired great riches, horses, possessions, slaves, wives, and he needed someplace to house all these things. Yet, these were the very things that God himself had warned the potential kings of Israel about back in Deuteronomy 17. It says, "The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself, or send his people to Egypt to buy horses. For the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. The king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself." God had warned the people. Money, sex, and power, the conventional desires of the world, would distract them from God's wisdom, which was contained in self-denial and in faithfulness. All of Solomon's God-given wisdom couldn't keep his reign from going sideways in a hurry. It devolved into idolatry and the reestablishment of high places and threats from the outside kingdoms and civil war from within. Before Solomon's grand kingdom would be shattered with only a remnant left for his son. All of this took place because Solomon failed to apply the wisdom that he had been given and to walk the hard road of obedience. Some of the wisest people in the world tend to be those who have endured hardship and lived through it, learning from their experiences and sharing their learnings with others. Those who are even wiser endure the hard way of following God despite the pressures of the world. The way of self-denial, sacrifice, and standing for the truth is what they've chosen. They, in turn, will help others along the way. Challenges in our lives, while not intentionally sought, they very well can help wise people to rethink how they see themselves, how they see others, and how they see God. The hard fact is that wisdom often comes at a price, but once it's gained, it's of great value. Personal wisdom is never developed in isolation, and self-transcendence requires a constant awareness and a nurturing of a relationship with God. This is best encouraged and lived out in a community with others who are seeking this same wisdom. Perhaps one of the reasons that Solomon ultimately failed was that he didn't have support. He didn't have others who were seeking the same path of wisdom. Instead, he relied more on himself than upon God. I have a question for you. Who is helping you discern God's wisdom? Are you involved with others here at church in such a way that they help you to discern? Do you have a group of people that help to guide you along the way and to keep you accountable? And on the flip side, to whom are you helping? This is what the church is all about. It's about helping us to gain an understanding of God's transcendent wisdom. It's really about developing this deep relational understanding of one another and of God. It's about walking alongside one another, knowing and encouraging each other. It's about reminding one another to focus on God, even through the hardest difficulties of our lives, and especially through these difficulties. Focusing on God through the disappointments and even through the distractions. It's a process, this gaining of transcendent wisdom. Some folks walk away from the church. You see, they tire of the conflicts and the personality differences that happen in the church, the controversies that arise in committee meetings, the church rules that sometimes might step on toes, the contention that can develop over different interpretations of scripture passages. But I believe this is how we develop a transcendent wisdom, this intimate knowledge of God. It's through the hard times. It's through the challenges that we turn to other believers and that we turn to God. Developing transcendent wisdom takes a commitment. It takes really getting some skin in the game. Do you know what that means? It means working hard, just like when you're playing a hard game of soccer. It means doing your very best. It means trying so hard that you might lose some skin in the process. Mother Teresa put it aptly. I have found the paradox that if you love until it hurts, there can be no more hurt, only more love. When we love like this, it changes our lives. It's through loving God, this striving for God, this working together, and being willing to jump in even when it might hurt. When we orient ourselves to God, this is how we gain transcendent wisdom. Remember the church, it's the body of Christ. God immensely loves the church. Our desire as the church should be to strive to understand and to know God in the same way. We do this by constantly pursuing God, by not giving up on each other, and by being courageous in our quest to honor God. It doesn't matter how old you are or at what stage in life you happen to be in. God offers wisdom to those who will seek it. We can't only seek it, but we have to live it out in obedience. The way of wisdom isn't easy, but our faithfulness honors God and leads to true abundance in our lives. May we be faithful in our living out the wisdom of God.